I'm going to talk about the processes and mechanics of how the SQL standard comes about. And then after this one, we'll have Vic talking about some of the contents of the SQL standard and how it compares to Postgres. So do stick around, please. All right, so Peter Eisentraut. I've been working in Postgres for a long time, work at EDB right now. So for the longest time, we've been working in Postgres on implementing SQL, right? And then somehow the actual SQL standards document just sort of appeared out of nowhere, and other people were working on it, right? And so a few years ago, I was encouraged to, find out how we can actually get into that process and be part of that process. So for about, it's 3 years now, actually. Since 2019, I've been in that working group, and I explained what WG means, or exactly what that is. And so I want to report here how that works. So usually at Postgres conferences like this, there's often a talk about how to become a contributor, how does the Postgres development process work, that kind of thing, right? There's also one, or there's actually several here this week. This is kind of that talk, but for SQL. If you want to become a contributor to that, or at least understand how it works, this is it. All right. So the first sort of section of this talk, I want to go through, and this is sort of what the challenge for me was initially, how do we even find these people, right? Where do they meet? So, and then, so that's what I'm going to go through. It's all going to be a little bit tedious, but then once we arrive there, then we can talk about how does it actually work and how do you make changes and things like that, right? So everybody has heard of ISO, right? That's the International Organization for Standardization. That's always the thing that's on the sort of the head of those documents. And there's also another organization called IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission. So those are just two separate international organizations that do standardization. So they happen to be both based in Geneva, but they're otherwise unrelated. So they all, at level below them, they have these what are called technical committees, right? And there's dozens, hundreds of them in each of them, right? And they have sort of the numbers of technical committees. 6, for example, has a title, deals with papers and board and on pulps, whatever. Okay, so things like that. For example, that technical, and so each of these technical committees has sort of an area that they deal with, right? And this is not only computer stuff. This has to do, with parts sizes of machines and processes and business requirements and things like that. So, for example, that TC6 actually standardizes paper sizes, the ones that are not used in this country, right? And so on. So there's lots of those. So, and then ISO and IEC figure they have sort of overlapping jurisdiction in a way in the area of information technology. So they somehow decided to form a joint technical committee, a JTC, on information technology. So all the stuff that you usually think of as what ISO does in computer stuff is usually goes through that technical committee. For example, C, C++, and all that kind of stuff is also going through that. And they have a website which was recently updated actually, so you can kind of look around there too. All right, so and then the next level down, you have subcommittees under committees. Right? And there's a couple dozen or something like that. And then you recognize some of them. Yeah, SC22 is programming languages, so there you would find C, C++. This multimedia, for example, has graphics formats, JPEG, and things like that. And well, SC32, that sounds like something that we should do, right? That's where all the data stuff happens. So SC32 is where our SQL stuff is happening. And then inside, as is the lowest level now, is that then you have the working groups. Right, so right now there's 4 working groups in SC32. This can change. Sometimes working groups new ones are founded, other ones get disbanded if whatever they're working on is not active anymore. So database languages are working group 3. Right? So this is something that the people who participate in this is always like WG3. It's always what you hear, like, oh, there's a WG3 meeting next month or something. So that's sort of the hierarchy, right? That you sort of then drill down, okay, this is kind of where we are, right? ISO, IEC, they're combined to form this technical committee 1. Inside of that, you have subcommittee 32 that deals with data stuff, and then inside of that, you have a working group 3 that deals with database languages, and that's where the SQL development happens. Now, so how do you find these people, right? Like, how do you become part of that? Or who is part of that? Yeah. So the one thing I also wasn't quite clear to me, like, what do these levels do? And the actual work is done in the working group, sort of the name suggests that. And then all the levels above that are sort of politics, essentially, right? Or sort of process management and things like that, right? So one thing I'm sort of marginally involved with is also ST32. That's kind of where the actual voting happens of, like, yes, we will do a next version of SQL. Yes, we will, in other cases, yes, we will do the next version of C++ or something like that. Whereas everything above here, I'm not involved. I just read sort of their bulletins and stuff like that. They do things sort of like style guides and stuff like that. So if you take like any ISO, IEC, JTC1 standard, like be it C, C++, anything else, they all have the same format and sort of the same sections in a certain order and requirements about how things should be sort of shaped and written. And so that is kind of decided in these upper tiers, but don't really have to worry about that. The real sort of interesting work happens at SC32 and below. So you can't just go to WG3 or you can't just go to ISO and say, like, I want to become a part of this and that working group. You have to, the members of ISO are the so-called national bodies. These are the standardization organizations of the various countries. So, you recognize some of these names. For the United States, it's ANSI, of course. And then in other countries, I'm based in Germany, so I'm going through the German standardization organization, which is DIN, D-I-N. And in other countries, there's others. AFNOR's in France, BSI is UK, NEN is Netherlands, and so on. So in order to participate in any kind of ISO, you have to first get into one of those. And then they will then send you on, right? So you then basically just pick the one that applies to you. For most people around here, maybe it's ANSI, or you can. There's some subtleties to that, right? Obviously, if you live in a certain country, you just go to the local one. But you could also live in a country maybe that doesn't participate in JTC1 or SC32. Then you, in a way, you're out of luck, or you could go maybe to the place where your employer is located. That might also work, depending on the local policies of that, right? So there are a number of participants in WG3 actually that are located in various countries, but their employer is located in the US, so they are actually members through ANSI, so that can also be done. And then each of these national bodies, they have what sort of the mirror committees in a way. They have a sort of a parallel structure to, their own little sort of committees and subcommittees that sort of mirror this international structure. And then, so, in the US, for example, the mirror committee is some number, code, blah, 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 data management, which then corresponds to the international committee. And Germany is also, some code of some numbers that has some meaning, and then it means that's where all the experts on data management in Germany are, in theory, sort of gathered, and then they get delegated to the international level. One particular sort of weird thing in the US is actually that you think of ANSI as the thing, right? We just mentioned them, but they don't actually do the standards development. There's another organization called Insights, which actually is sort of contracted by ANSI to do the real work. So in some way, you end up dealing with both of these organizations. It's kind of weird. But they have a website. Obviously, these slides will be posted, so if someone wants to actually follow along, that website there from Insights is actually kind of useful. It gives you contact information and things like that. if you are from the United States and are interested in that. So to actually become a participant member in WG3, you find the appropriate national body, as I mentioned, that usually the one that is sort of in your country. You contact them somehow. It's like, I want to participate in that committee, and you have to exchange some paperwork, sign some things, pay a fee. They're quite picky about the paperwork because this whole thing, they're really sort of worried about intellectual property sort of tracking, let's say, right? You don't want to develop an international standard and then it turns out, oh, there's some patent thing someone snuck in here, right? So you have to write, sort of sign disclaimers and stuff like that. This is, in sort of the work I've been doing, this hasn't really come up so much, but you can imagine in stuff like multimedia formats, video encodings and stuff like that, that's super important. So that's why there's all this paperwork. You can't just sort of show up and say, hi, there's a process, they need to know your name and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and then you basically get delegated to the international working group. Some of these processes are like a century old by now, so you could imagine in the olden days they met in their capital and then they actually traveled to the place. Now this is all on the internet, right? So, but that's kind of how that works, right? You join your local organization and then you get sort of delegated to the international organization. By that, what really just happens is just you get a login to their content management system, basically. You can also end up in SC32. In SC32, the voting is by country, and so there's only usually one person per country has to show up. But sometimes it happens that you're the only person in that country, and then you're by default the so-called head of delegation, and you can also go there and vote on things. But if you're in a larger country, like the US, there's a sizable group of people who are actually in WG3, and then you have one of them gets sort of nominated as the head of the delegation and does the voting on these upper levels. Right. Any questions on that by chance? All right. Right, so as I mentioned, on the upper levels there, the voting or sort of the participation is by national body, so it's by country. But in the working groups, the term is the participants there are individual experts. So you only represent yourself and your expertise. So when I'm there, I'm not representing, I'm not representing Germany. I'm not representing Postgres. I'm not representing EDB. I'm just myself with my expertise, so I can act independently. Obviously, my expertise is informed by all of that, right? And I'm supposed to do that, but I'm not bound by anyone really, right? So that's important. All right, so then once you've done that, and that if you know who to contact, this takes a few weeks, ideally. Right? You sign some paperwork, they process you, and get you the login, and then you're there. So then you have the working group meetings, and some of this applies to other working groups, C++ working groups, and some of that is very similar. Right? So there's these consistent processes, but each working group also has their own conventions and things like that. So in the before times, right, there were usually 2 to 3 meetings a year in person. So you would go to some place, and this kind of moves around the world for usually a week each in some hotel, could be, or maybe just a place like this, basically, right? You meet there for a week, and you work through your agenda. And then one of those meetings is then also the SC32 meeting. That's usually, in case of WG3, in June or so the middle of the year. You do sort of the process management, essentially, and sort of approve what the working plan for the next year, and then sort of then in between, throughout the rest of the year, you have the actual working meetings. All right, and then sort of just about when I joined this all fell apart in early 2020. So there was really, as far as I could tell, no tradition of sort of online meetings in ISO, really, or JTC1. So they all had to make up new stuff, right, and just sort of figure out like how can be, what would be the, because they are really also concerned about the, sort of fairness, and you can't just have secret meetings and just exclude people, right? You need to be sure to have a fair process. So they had to write a whole new sort of set of, requirements and processes to hold online meetings, and since then we've been having monthly online meetings, using Zoom. So it's the same as, it works Zoom, you just turn around, do the other Zoom, same thing. So and again, we sort of had to figure that out. How long can, how much time do you need, and what's reasonable, and what kind of schedules do you do? And so what we've been sort of doing is usually have sort of 2 or 3 hours per day, and then over 2 or 3 days. So you would maybe have Monday, Wednesday, Thursday from, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. or something like that. So something like that. So if you kind of count the hours, it kind of ends up covering the same amount of time, really. So, yeah, and the future is, as everybody's thinking about now, is somehow in between, I guess, right? And this is just something we're figuring out now. We've been having sort of, in the immediate future, a mix of some in-person and some virtual meetings. So in a way, for me, this was kind of fortunate, right? Because, I have things to do. I can't travel around all the time. I'm here, but this is obviously, 3 weeks a year somewhere else in some remote place is a certain time commitment and financial commitment, So for me, this was kind of easy to get into because you just do a Zoom call. But now we'll see. So the sort of the current recent meetings that have been happening. So we had one meeting earlier this year in Berlin. That was the SD32 sort of meeting. That was also the last, I'll get back to that later, but that was also the sort of the last meeting before the next version of the SQL standard is sort of finalized. So we actually did 2 weeks there because we had sort of a backlog to work through. And there was a virtual meeting in August. There's a meeting next week, actually, starting on Monday in Ohrid in northern Macedonia, which I will not go to, just because I'm here. I gotta get back to work. And then there's a couple of other virtual meetings scheduled, and then the next year is just about sort of thinking about this now, finalizing plans in February to do a meeting in the Netherlands, and the rest is kind of being still contemplated. There's probably going to be one somewhere in the US next June, sort of, and that would sort of complete one cycle of the year. But we'll see what what actually happens. So one tradition that's particular to WG3 is that you name the meetings by the airport code of the city you're in, so that all the sort of the papers and the minutes of the agendas of that meeting are sort of coded by that code. So the agenda for the Berlin meeting is BER001, for example, and things like that. So that also requires, in a way, that you don't go to the same place again, which is sort of implied benefit, right? Or if you go to a larger city, they have multiple airports, you can sort of come to New York 3-4 times, maybe, something like that. And then also leads to, there was a meeting, I don't know, this was already made a long time ago. There's an airport code called SQL, so there's been an SQL meeting. There's also, I did just notice that the other day, there's actually the airport code for the meeting in the Netherlands is going to be UTC. That's probably going to be confusing somehow at some point. And the web meetings have just been numbered. So if we'll see how it actually turns out now with the pandemic. But in early 2020, we were like, well, if we're going to run out of W and then 2-digit numbers here, I think we'll be in real trouble. So hopefully we're only sort of a quarter of the way through that now. Okay. All right, so this is actually what the meeting looks like. This was the Berlin meeting. If you can see over there, that's the same laptop as is here. So it's this was in the headquarters of Dean. This depends. Sometimes it's in a hotel in a resort. Sometimes it's in at an actual national body office building. Sometimes it's in a hotel or something like that. So you just sit around and the way this was then, over here was a presentation screen similar to in this room, and then somebody's presenting something and everybody listens and discusses kind of thing, right? So as you can see over there, sort of the Unix Spirit faction as well. This is later that week, a different room. You can see other familiar faces there as well if you look around this room. So it's just, it's not very terribly glorious, it's just work. And then, of course, in the evening, you go out and do things. All right, so there is two people's names who it might be useful to kind of know. There's for each working group, there's a convener, which is kind of the chairperson who actually calls the meeting, makes sure only the people supposed to be there are there, and make sure the minutes are done and stuff like that, right? So that's, in this case, Keith Hare, who actually took these photos, so he's not actually on here, so he's the one who's standing here taking that photo. But I put his email address on here as well, because he's quite sort of, he's outreachy also, and if somebody has a question of like, what's going on, or do you have any information, when is the next version of SQL coming out, you can email him too. He's good. And then the editor of 9075, which is SQL, is Jim Melton. He's sort of almost a legend, one could say. He's that's him over here. He's been doing this for, what did he say, 35 years or something? Yeah, so that's his lifetime's project. So he's the name. If you actually get the SQL standard, his name is at the bottom as the editor. Right? So these are maybe two names to maybe aware of. So each working group has, over the whole ISO whatnot, right? Each working group could have a number of projects. Project is basically a term for something that produces a document at the end. This could be a standard. There's also a couple other things. There could be technical reports. There could, some variants of that sort. So, and they all have these numbers that end up being ISO something, right? So in WG3, there's a number of projects going on right now or contemplated. And they have these numbers that are obviously with some whimsy have been sort of picked to be recognizable. That's not, I think they probably had to ask for that specifically. Normally you just get assigned a number if you have a new project. But so 9075 is SQL that we know. 19075, or they used to be called technical reports. Now they've been renamed for some process reasons, but they're smaller documents that explain various pieces of the SQL standard. So there's one, for example, for sort of analytics, which covers window functions and things like that. There's one for JSON. There's one for temporal. That shows the helper documents, basically, right? So they're not as dry and things like that. They're actually meant to be sort of a tutorial almost. So if you find those are actually good readings. Then the 29075 is currently not used. There is a plan to do some work on function library. So basically sort of an external specification of like analytics functions that then could be pulled into by SQL somehow. That's kind of a project that's may or may not happen. 39075 is a new thing. There's a new database language called GQL, which is just in the final stages of being developed now. It's a graph query language. So that is sort of some of you might know, for example, Cypher, the graph language that came out of Neo4j. And there's a couple others. And so they've actually all gotten together and are developing sort of an official standardized graph query language now. And so that will probably come out sometime in the next 18 months, I think, is the schedule. So you might see that sort of in the news at some point. And then 49075 would be the equivalent of these guidance standards but for GQL, so that's a kind of a reserved number. So there's, there's just pointing this out that WG3 is not only working on just SQL all the time. There's a couple other sort of things going on the side too. So now that you found the group and you came to a meeting, how do you change anything if you want? I mean, obviously at the beginning you kind of lurk a little bit, and then how do you do anything? I mean, so in a way, this is not too at least I found it not too dissimilar to how you make a change in Postgres, right? You just show up. First, you have to figure out where to show up, and then you show up, lurk a little bit, and you make a proposal, and the proposal gets shot down a few times. And then maybe at one point you engage in a discussion somehow, and then maybe it gets accepted or not, or people will give you feedback, and you try a couple more times, and then at some point it gets committed. Something like that, right? So this is not too dissimilar here, right? You write, except you're not writing code, you're writing a text document. So mechanics are different, but it's the same idea. So you write a change proposal. It's called paper, but it's a document. I'll show an example in a moment. Then you upload it to the content management system, basically, into the subfolder, so other people will see it there, and then they can look at it ahead of time. Then you go to the meeting, you present, you get called, you present, you kind of get up, put it on the screen, you present, and you can sort of do a good job or a bad job of sort of shaping a proposal, right? Ideally, you do it sort of, you reason it initially, then you explain alternatives you considered and drawbacks and this and that, and then you give the actual change proposal, similar how you do a patch, right? And then it just gets discussion, or you get some discussion, maybe feedback, maybe you do a second version. If things get accepted, then you're done. Then the editor is kind of the committer in a way, right? Then takes it and integrates it into the whole document. And then after a while, the whole document gets released, and then you have become part of that. So it's, again, not too dissimilar to how you do Postgres development, perhaps. So now I have an example. Let's see if that link works. This is a very, very small one, but just so you have an idea of how this works. So you just write a document that explains what you want. Right? There's some format guidelines, just like there are format guidelines how to format a patch, but if you know the rules, you can bend them. It kind of works that way. So this was a proposal that I did for the W11 meeting. So that was last year. And the purpose of this paper is to add a new aggregate function to the SQL standard. The aggregate function is called AnyValue. So this was accepted. So this is a live one here, so to speak. So in this case, there's sort of it was a sort of different process. This wasn't my idea really, but there's a process which I'll explain in a moment, that at certain stages you send your draft out to the wider ISO world for commenting. It's called a ballot comment, basically. And you get feedback. It's kind of a beta, essentially. And then people send you all kinds of feedback, and then you work through that. So in this case, I just took a ballot comment, and the ballot comment basically said, SQL standard should really have this AnyValue function for this and that reason. And then I basically just said in my introduction, yeah, based on that, we should really do that. In a different circumstance, I would have just put my own reasoning here. Right. So, there's a bit of an explanation of how this should work, and then the actual change is kind of these editing instructions down here that you say, like, in section 1, you added this sentence, and in section 5, you add that one, and then you put some BNF. If you have seen the SQL standard, it kind of looks like that. I'm just explaining how to change it. And then the editor would then go through and actually type that in. All right, so change this thing here, add a reserved word, new feature code. If you know how the SQL standard is, you have to put all these boxes. A new reserved word, you have to explain what the function does, you have to put the feature code in, and then that's really it. In this case, it's obviously very, very simple because the AnyValue function just returns any value. So the actual technical description is very short, because the technical description of this is if you use any value, the return value is implementation dependent. So that's it. Normally, if you write a new feature, you actually have to write a lot of text to actually describe what the feature does, right? So sometimes these papers are 10, 20, 30, 50 pages long, sometimes 2 pages. Just like there's, one-line patches and 350K patches. All right, so that is an example of a paper, which I don't remember exactly, but presumably I took that to the meeting, presented it, and then it was approved. That's going to be in the next version of SQL. Questions? Right, so this is kind of what I already alluded to. There's a fixed sort of phases of developing an ISO standard. And this is, in a way, similar how you do software again, right? You start somewhere, and then you have betas, and then you have this, and you have that. So these are all the sort of abbreviations that you then learn over time. So NWIP is new work item proposal. That's basically that you say that you're going to do it. You're going to do something. Then you have working drafts. Those are just sort of the running state of your document. Then you have a committee draft, which is basically a beta that you say, here, we made some progress, what do you think? And then you get feedback. And then when you think you're done, you think you're really, really done, then you do a DIS, which is Draft International Standard. At that point, there's basically no more technical changes allowed. And this is what we're doing with SQL right now. So as I mentioned at the Berlin meeting, we had a CD ballot for SQL starting sometime last year, I believe. And so, there have been sort of several hundred comments came in. We had to work through those. At the Berlin meeting, we finished all of them. And then that document was then shipped off to somewhere on the internet, Geneva, notionally, let's say, for publication as a DIS ballot. And that should actually start, I think, next week or the week after that should start. And then that gets then voted on, and then if that's approved, then if step 4 is approved, then you go straight to 6. In some exceptional cases, you also do step 5, which is a final draft international standard. So if you kind of messed up at 4, you might have to go through 5. It's kind of like that. And so there's different ways where like on what level the voting happens. So on the CD ballot, only the participants in SC32 vote, but in the other stages, everyone who's participant, again, everyone meaning all the national bodies who are participants in JTC1 vote. Okay, so that's the progress I already alluded to. So 9075, which is SQL, is currently in some kind of limbo, but it's been sort of sent off for a DIS ballot, but the ballot hasn't actually started. And the ballot comment is 12 weeks, so that'll take us from end of September to sometime the end of December. And then if there will be some comments. We'll have to work through those. That will probably be happening at that Netherlands meeting in February. And then that will be then sent off again for publication, essentially. So in what the current estimate is, in March 2023, there will be a new version of SQL. One thing I'm not sure of And nobody could really answer that. So it might be a surprise whether it would be called SQL 2023 or SQL 2022, based on the fact that this ballot started this year. So don't be surprised, or if you see that next year, don't be surprised whether I told you the wrong thing today, right? It could be 22 or 23, don't really know. All right. So now the real question, like, what's in it for me? So, you know, the basics of SQL are pretty stable, right? They're not going to change. So there's work around the edges and expansion into some new areas, but you know, don't expect any sort of I don't know what, right? So a lot of the new work, I mean, the majority of the work over the last, you know, when was the last one? 2016. So over the last 5 or so years, has been on this new part, SQL PGQ, which is property graph query. So that is also graph stuff, right? So we have the GQL stuff being worked on that I mentioned. That's a whole new language that's different from SQL. And then there's PGQ, which is almost like a subset of that, but usable from inside SQL. So a lot of the work there is shared, but GQL is a new language that works completely differently from SQL, but the graph querying stuff inside of it is the same. So a lot of that work has gone into that. And sort of the other major bucket, I guess, is the new JSON stuff. So that's still of interest to expand on JSON stuff, as you know, similar to the interest in Postgres itself. So that's still happening, and some other smaller stuff I can show. So here's just so you have an idea what this PGQ stuff is about. I have an actual presentation on this in detail, and so others do as well. If you get these slides later, there's a link down there, or we'll figure it out some other. So this is kind of how this could look. So there's a new from clause variant called graph table, and then inside of that you have a graph matching expression which has these arrows and stuff like that. So if you've ever seen Cypher, perhaps, that's based on that or similar to that. So you can actually sort of define a graph based on tables, and then you query your tables as if they were a graph. It's a whole thing. I can't get into that now, but that's there. So more JSON stuff. So the first one is kind of maybe odd, right? But if you remember in SQL 2016, there was a bunch of JSON functionality added. You know, JSON object, JSON array, JSON table, all these kind of things maybe you've seen, and many of those are in Postgres. Many of those kind of came via Postgres. But there was no JSON type, because you could use these operators only sort of on text fields, basically. And so now a JSON type has been added. And the reason for that is sort of very pragmatic. Basically, in 2016, they just ran out of time. So you do what you do sometimes in software engineering. You just, do what you can and then do the rest later. So there's no real reason other than it was just ran out of time. And so with the JSON type, there's also definitions of sort of how do you compare a JSON datum, how do you sort it, and stuff like that. So you have to define all these things. That's why it takes some time. There's a couple of these what are called item methods. If you've used JSON in Postgres, you might know those, right? There's like dot various things, right? There's like, I think right now there's like things like dot double and stuff like that, so you can convert values to certain types inside JSON, and there's more now. There's like timestamp support and stuff like that in a JSON path language and stuff like that, so it's kind of neat. And then there's a thing, this will be interesting in Postgres. It's called a simplified accessor. So you can do, if you have a column of a JSON type, you can write column and then sort of dig into that one using SQL syntax. So instead of writing, bracket A bracket B or something like that, you can just do .a.b.c. I think that's kind of neat. So that's kind of what the people want in a way, right? So just use JSON as if it were a structure. So yeah, I think obviously we had a bit of a setback with JSON and Postgres, but over time, I think these things could come into Postgres. Yes.
I guess a semantic Postgres specific question: is the JSON type defined as JSON or JSON B in standard?
The question is if the JSON type is defined as JSON or JSON B. Well, it's defined in terms of the semantics, right? So how you implement it doesn't matter, but it does have. I guess it is more like JSON B, I guess, in terms of the semantics, because it doesn't care about like white space and line breaks, and so I think this is a project we should tackle independent of that, but maybe this supports that we somehow make JSON B really JSON and get rid of JSON, that kind of stuff. So yeah, so more JSON work coming. I mean, I've been trying to encourage some people, but I think a lot of people are burnt out right now, so we'll maybe let that sit for a little while and come back to that. And there are very smaller bits, some of which you might recognize. So this unique null treatment is actually in Postgres 15. So you can treat null values in unique constraints as either being distinct or not distinct. That is, the background there is more like the way it used to be written was ambiguous. So it wasn't, if you read the first, the section 4 or whatever, it says one thing, and if you read it in section 5, it says the other thing. And so somebody noticed, like, wait, this doesn't match, so what are we going to do? And then existing implementations already behave differently, so then it was basically an option was added, as you do. So this is in Postgres 15 now, actually. And another change is that you don't actually have to specify length for varchar anymore, which of course has been in Postgres forever. But that's now official, so to speak. And a bunch of sort of functions have been added that already exist in the wild in various implementations. So this is now basically kind of consolidates them into a standard. Sometimes this is the way it happens, right? There is no different standards, organizations, and groups have different requirements in terms of sort of the order in which things should happen. For example, W3, the World Wide Web Consortium, they usually require implementations to exist before they standardize it. Whereas in SQL, it's often that the actual spec is written and then is later implemented. But it can also happen the other way around, that you say, like, hey, there's 8 different implementations that all have greatest and least. We might as well put that in the standard to unify the semantics. And so that's what happens with some of these. Right? So all of these at the top are already in Postgres. And the any value that I just mentioned, that's not yet in Postgres, but is it still being worked on, or are there problems? No, okay, it's in progress. Cool. And this one, I think this is kind of cool, that you can write these different ways of writing numbers. If you used any programming language in the last 10 years, you've probably seen that, because most programming languages nowadays can do stuff like that. Python, Ruby, Java, Go, they all have that kind of syntax, many more. And so that you can also, so there's 2 aspects to that. Basically, you can have hexadecimal, octal, and binary numbers, and you can have these underscores to group numbers. I find the second one actually sort of quite useful, because oftentimes I do some sort of ad hoc benchmarking. You do some kind of something generate series 1 through 1,000,000 to see how fast something runs, and then I'm always have to be like, is that actually 1,000,000 or 10 million? And then you increase the number until you get like a good runtime, and it's like, is that like 10 million now? Or you can't, it's hard to kind of tell. So this kind of helps you with that. As computers go faster, the numbers get bigger. So having some grouping of that is useful. I've started working on that. There's sort of half a patch was already posted for Postgres 15, but I do hope to finish that by Postgres 16. All right, so what's next? Similar to how people ask you what's next in Postgres, there's no roadmap, of course, because everybody has like their own direction, idea, priorities. There's no sort of the people who participate in WG3. They're in a way volunteers, right? They're employed and paid, but there's no common roadmap of this. But you can sort of read between the lines of what people are interested in. But there's definitely going to be another round of work on PGQ, right? That's just, I see there's a backlog of things that were sort of dropped at the last moment just to get it finished now, and there's definitely more stuff. And more JSON stuff too, right? I talked to some people that are interested in doing JSON schema support. So coming back to, sort of JSON's all fun and games, but at some point you want a schema apparently. So yeah, we'll see about that. That could potentially be interested in for Postgres, right? Streaming has been sort of on the agenda for a long time. So sort of running aggregates and that kind of stuff, right? So I haven't seen an actual proposal, but I keep hearing that it is somewhere being worked on. But ultimately, again, whatever we like also, we can come up with anything we want, bring it to a meeting, get shut down, right? So obviously you have to read the room a little bit, but there's no specific reason why we couldn't do anything we want. Okay, so yeah, here's a little bit of a half joke, but half sort of what I did in my head, right? As I mentioned earlier, the work in WG3 is not too different from working in an open source community like Postgres, because there are sort of volunteers in a way from different companies with their own agendas, but also a common agenda. And you kind of try to work together to make the whole thing better, but also satisfy your own requirements. And so there's this very similar culture that you have to sort of define your own agenda, but be prepared to get rejected harshly, but in good spirits and things like that. So I found it very, based on my experience, it was actually quite easy to get into, but it's, for someone who is just expecting an office environment, it's not the same thing, right? So yeah, so working draft is sort of the running progress. Committee draft, and I mentioned, is kind of like a beta. The DIS is sort of the release candidate that we're in now. Yeah, WG3 is kind of a hacker, so that's the day-to-day work, and then the SC32 is kind of what we used to have, hopefully have sometime again, the developer meeting that we sometimes have had up in Ottawa, where we sort of meet once a year and define, sort of make process adjustments, perhaps, right? The change proposal paper I just showed is basically like a patch, and then the meeting is like the commit fest. So you line up all the, sometimes 20, sometimes 50 papers, and then you just try to work through them. Right? And then the editors are the people who would actually then do the final commits. So as a visual aid, but also to underscore this point that it's not too dissimilar. Okay, I got 50 seconds left. So to conclude, so first, if you want to participate, there's a way to do it. If you're interested, let me know. But also, secondly, if obviously, if you don't want to do the actual time commitment and so on, there's also a way you can contact me, or Vic's also currently working through the process. That the other people from the other companies, they are also getting sort of feedback from their colleagues and so on. So you don't actually have to show up to do a thing. If you're interested, if you have an idea, you can also work through your representative, so to speak. I guess the final point is, you could see from the photos, the group's not too big anymore, right? A lot of people have retired. Some of the other people on the photo will retire. So I think it is up to us. Younger people, but also, Postgres is now the thing, right? Now it's it used to be the big vendors did SQL. We're the big vendor now, right? So I think it is important that somehow we take over, support this process going on, because if nobody's going to do it, then they'll just say one day SQL is canceled, and that's not a good result for us, having thought of no SQL for so long and then just kind of have the whole thing fall apart if we're not taking care of it, right? So again, if you're interested, it's quite fun if you're sort of today in this SQL nerd track, maybe you're interested. But it literally says 0 up there, so we don't have time for questions, but I'll be around. So thank you so much for now, and then please stick around for the next talk. Thank you.